Victoria Ashford had built her fortune on two things: intelligence and instinct. At 23, she developed an algorithm that revolutionized supply chain management. By 30, she was a billionaire. By 40, she was a legend. Her penthouse was in Manhattan, her winter estate in Aspen, and her primary residence was Ashford Manor, a sprawling mansion in the hills overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The home was a monument to success, filled with priceless art, marble sculptures, and memories of a life lived at the pinnacle of human achievement. It was also, she'd come to realize over the past 3 years, utterly empty. The loneliness had crept in slowly, like fog through a canyon. Her marriage had ended when her ex-husband finally admitted he couldn't compete with her ambitions. Her friendships had withered when she stopped making time for anyone who didn't directly contribute to her bottom line. Her relationship with her only daughter had fractured entirely after Victoria had made a choice to acquire Collington Tech during what was supposed to be their vacation together in Italy. Sarah hadn't forgiven her. Sarah no longer answered her calls. Victoria had filled the mansion with staff: a head chef, a personal trainer, 2 house managers, a gardener, and most recently, cleaning and maintenance personnel. She'd installed security cameras throughout the property. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of habit. When you lived at the level Victoria did, you protected your assets. And after her ex-husband had tried to claim he'd left his Patek Philippe watch at the mansion 2 years after their divorce, she'd become vigilant. People couldn't be trusted, even the ones you paid. The cleaning crew came 3 times a week. Victoria barely noticed them. They were part of the infrastructure of her home, like the plumbing and electrical systems. She'd seen the employment files, of course. She reviewed all hiring personally. The head of the cleaning team was a woman named Maria, in her 60s, who'd worked for wealthy families for 30 years. Her references were impeccable. Her team rotated based on the mansion's needs. It was Monday when Marcus Chen had started as the new custodian on the maintenance rotation. Victoria didn't even register the change until her house manager, Derek, mentioned it during their Tuesday morning meeting. The previous custodian had to return to his hometown to care for his mother, Derek had explained, his tone professional and efficient. "We've brought in Marcus Chen. He comes highly recommended from the Harrington estate. He'll handle all repairs, maintenance, and deep cleaning projects." Victoria had nodded without really listening. She'd been reviewing merger documents for a tech startup she was considering acquiring. The human side of her business operations held zero interest for her anymore. What mattered was performance, reliability, and discretion. But on Wednesday evening, something unusual happened. Victoria had been working late in her private study on the 3rd floor when she heard a sound. Not alarming, exactly, more like something heavy being moved, followed by what sounded like frustrated muttering. It was coming from her daughter's bedroom. Her old bedroom, Sarah's room, which Victoria kept exactly as it had been 12 years ago when her daughter had left for college and essentially never come back. The room had become a time capsule of Sarah's childhood, preserved in amber, a silent monument to Victoria's failure as a mother. Victoria had stopped working. She'd sat still in her leather chair, listening. She knew she should go investigate, should demand to know why someone was in her house making noise in a room they'd been given no authorization to enter. But she didn't move. Instead, she'd simply waited and listened. The sounds had continued for another 5 minutes, then stopped. Victoria had heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. She'd told herself she'd look into it in the morning, but she knew she wouldn't. Some part of her didn't want to know. Some part of her was afraid. Thursday morning had brought a different kind of shock. She'd gone to the kitchen for her protein smoothie and espresso. Her breakfast never varied, and found a note on the marble counter in neat, careful handwriting. It wasn't from Derek or Maria. The handwriting was different, personal. "Dear Ms. Ashford, I noticed the ceiling light in the 3rd floor east bedroom was flickering and the window lock on the south side was faulty. I took the liberty of repairing both. If you'd like me to address anything else in that room, please let me know. I hope you don't mind. Marcus." Victoria had stood in her kitchen, holding that note, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. She'd felt seen. She'd felt like someone had noticed something about her that actually mattered. That was when she'd called Derek and asked him to activate the security footage from that room. She'd wanted to understand what had happened. She'd wanted to see what Marcus had done, why he'd gone into that room, what he'd thought when he saw it frozen in time like some kind of shrine to failure. Now, 3 days later, Victoria sat in the security room, her hand hovering over the mouse to play the footage. She'd been too afraid to watch it until now, and in that fear, she'd made a decision that would define everything that came next. She'd pulled the footage not just from Sarah's bedroom, but from every camera in the mansion. She wanted to know everything about Marcus Chen. She wanted to know if he could be trusted. She wanted to know if her instinct to close off her heart from everyone around her had been right all along. The security system showed her that Marcus was currently in the basement, replacing a water pipe. She had at least 2 hours before he left for the day. 2 hours to understand the truth about the man who was suddenly everywhere in her home. Victoria clicked play on the footage from Wednesday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. What she saw first was Marcus entering Sarah's room with a toolbox. He was a man in his late 30s, with dark hair and the kind of posture that suggested someone who'd learned to make himself smaller than he naturally was. He wore the standard custodian uniform, navy and gray, and he moved with surprising grace for someone carrying tools. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at the room. Victoria watched his face as he took in the details: the single bed with its lavender duvet, the wall of bookshelves with their neat rows of young adult novels, the desk with its collection of ballet point shoes arranged on a shelf, the photographs of a smiling blonde girl at various ages covering one wall from childhood through her senior year of high school. Marcus's expression shifted. Victoria, who prided herself on reading people, couldn't quite name what she saw there. Not pity, exactly. Something more like recognition. Like sorrow. He approached the ceiling light first, set down his toolbox, and got to work. He was meticulous, careful not to disturb anything in the room, setting each item he needed aside with deliberate precision. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to the photographs, to the evidence of a life that had been carefully documented and then stopped. Victoria leaned closer to the screen. She realized she was holding her breath. When Marcus finished with the light, he moved to the window. As he worked on the lock, she heard him speak, just barely audible in the recording. He was talking to himself, or maybe to the room, or maybe to the girl in the photographs. "She must be wondering where you went," he said softly. "Someone doesn't keep photos up like this unless they're hoping you'll come back." Victoria's hands went cold. Marcus continued his work in silence after that. But before he left the room, he did something that made Victoria's breath catch. He picked up the ballet point shoes from the shelf. Victoria remembered Sarah had danced from ages 5 to 14, until Victoria had refused to miss a business meeting to attend her final performance. She'd sent a car with a check instead, with a note saying how proud she was. Marcus didn't disturb the display, but he examined the shoes carefully, respectfully, like he was holding something sacred. Then he set them back down, exactly as they'd been. When he left the room, he pulled the door almost shut behind him, the way someone might pull the door of a sleeping child's room. Victoria sat back in her chair, her heart racing. She didn't know what she'd expected to see: theft, disrespect, judgment. Not this. Not this careful tenderness toward the artifacts of someone's grief. She checked the timestamp. The visit had lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes of Marcus giving more care and attention to her failure as a mother than Victoria herself had in the 3 years since Sarah had stopped coming home. That night, Victoria found herself unable to focus. She'd ordered food but didn't eat it. She'd tried to work but couldn't concentrate. Around 9 p.m., she'd gotten up and gone to Sarah's room. She'd stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at it the way Marcus must have looked at it. She'd noticed, for the first time in years, that the room was deeply, achingly sad. It was then that Victoria had made a decision that would have been unthinkable to her just days before. She'd activated the house-wide cameras to follow Marcus. Not because she suspected him of anything, but because she needed to understand him. She needed to understand how someone could care about a stranger's pain so much that they'd treat her child's empty room like it was sacred. What Victoria discovered over the next week would crack open every assumption she'd built her life upon. And it would all come to a head on Friday night, when she finally watched the footage that changed everything. The footage from Friday showed Marcus arriving for his evening shift at 6 p.m., as usual. He carried his toolbox and a small duffel bag. Victoria noted he always did. She'd asked Derek about it. Marcus worked 2 jobs, maintenance here during the evening shifts, and day work at a commercial cleaning company. He was, according to Derek's research, a single father. He had a daughter, age 13. Victoria watched as Marcus moved through the lower levels of the mansion, performing his assigned tasks. She saw him check the HVAC system, clean the basement thoroughly, organize the storage areas. He worked with the same meticulous care she'd seen in Sarah's room, treating her space with respect that bordered on reverence. Then, at 7:34 p.m., something unexpected happened. One of the cameras caught Marcus in the main living room, the one with the glass walls overlooking the canyon and the city lights beyond. He wasn't supposed to be in there. Derek had given him specific instructions to avoid disturbing the main living areas unless necessary. But Marcus had entered the room, set down his tools, and stood perfectly still, looking out at the view. Victoria watched his shoulders drop. She watched him stand there, just breathing, for 3 minutes. 3 minutes where a man doing 2 jobs to support his family stood in front of a view that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and something in his posture suggested he was grieving. Then, Marcus had wiped his eyes, squared his shoulders, and turned to leave. But he stopped. He looked at the grand piano in the corner, a Steinway that Victoria had bought as an investment and never learned to play. Sarah had played. Victoria had been too busy to ever attend a recital. Marcus approached the piano like it was an altar. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, carefully, he sat down at the bench. He placed his hands on the keys. And he began to play. Victoria froze. The audio on the camera was good, not perfect, but clear enough. And what she heard was Chopin. A nocturne, heartbreaking and beautiful and full of a longing so profound that Victoria felt it like a physical pain in her chest. Marcus played like his life depended on it. Like every note was a prayer. Like the piano was the only thing keeping him tethered to something that mattered. He played for 4 minutes. When he finished, he sat there with his hands resting on the keys, his head bowed. He didn't move for 30 seconds. Then he carefully closed the keyboard cover, stood up, and returned to his work. Victoria sat in the darkness of the security room and realized she was crying. She never cried. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried. The footage continued. Marcus finished his shift. He packed up his tools and his duffel bag. As he was leaving, one of the cameras caught his face in the entryway. His expression was a complex knot of emotions: sadness, longing, determination, resignation. The face of someone carrying something too heavy. Victoria sat with that image frozen on the screen for a long time. Then she did something that surprised her. She looked up the employee file for Marcus Chen. Derek had noted his address, his phone number, his emergency contact. There was a photograph from his hiring paperwork. In the photo, Marcus looked tired but kind. The kind of face that suggested someone who'd been through things but hadn't become bitter about them. Under emergency contact, Derek had noted, daughter, Emma Chen, age 13. Victoria read that line 4 times. Emma, 13 years old. A daughter. Just like Sarah. Just like the girl in the photographs in the room that Marcus had treated like holy ground. That was when Victoria made a choice. A choice to break every rule she'd set for herself in 52 years. A choice to acknowledge that she'd been wrong about something fundamental. A choice to reach out across the distance she'd created, not to a stranger, but to someone who had shown her, through silent actions and a beautiful rendition of Chopin, what actually mattered. She didn't know what she would do yet. She didn't know what she would say. She only knew that on Friday night, after she'd watched Marcus Chen play piano with his eyes closed and his heart open, Victoria Ashford had felt something crack open inside her own closed heart. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never be the same. The question was, what would she do about it?